Now maybe you remember that originally I showed a little bit of a bigger project as an example of why we might want to consider using the composition API. I showed this example at the beginning of the composition API module, and at the end of that module we migrated that project from the options API to the composition API. Now, you find that latest snapshot attached to this lecture because I want to pick up on that. I want to start there and now talk about reusing functionality because that's something we haven't done in that project up to that point. We stopped when we migrated it to the composition API, but now I want to reuse some functionality. And there is one main functionality which I would like to reuse. In userList.view, I got my search functionality, 2 pieces of data, a computed property, and a watcher, and this function here. And we have pretty much the same in projects list. We're dealing with different data there. Here we have a list of projects which we filter. In user list, we have a list of users. But besides that, it's the same functionality. So let's see how we can now use a custom hook to outsource this into a function which we can then use in both user list and projects list. For this, I'll add a new folder next to components, and I will again name it hooks, and in there I will add a search.js file. There I'll add a function useSearch following that naming pattern which I recommended. And I will already export it because I plan on using and calling useSearch in user list and projects list. Now, as I mentioned, there is a lot of functionality we have in common. So why don't we just go to user list and maybe grab all that code here. So the 2 refs, the computed property, available users, the watcher, and this update search function, and copy it into search.js into our useSearch function, like this. Now we need to add an import, because I'm using a bunch of features which are not available in that file yet. The ref functions, the computed function, the watch function, yeah, that should be it. So we should add an import, and import from the Vue framework. And there specifically, I want to import ref, computed, and watch, since these are the 3 functions I'm using in this file now. With that code should almost work. Not entirely though. One problem which we will face is that we depend on props users filter. Now in this function, props is not available. Even if we call it in our setup method later, inside of the scope of this function, props doesn't exist. But of course we can work around that. We can simply add a parameter and maybe name it items to have a generic function that works on any kind of items, no matter if that's people or projects. That's why I'm just naming it items to make it clear that this should work on any kind of array. And then we could use items.filter here and also replace props users with items in the other places here, like this. And I'll rename my users helper variable here to filtered items and use that in all the places where I used users to make this more generic. I will also rename the entire computed property to available items, because this is now no longer focused on users, but on any items we want to search. Now we will still have a problem though. The function which is passed to filter here has specific logic for filtering that will only work on our users, because here I'm filtering on a full name. In projects list, for example, I'm filtering on a title. Now there are 2 ways of making this work. We could accept this filtering function as another parameter, a filter function, which we then, for example, just pass here, like this. That would be one alternative. Then we have to pass in the function that should be used here from the place where we call useSearch. Or if we know that we will always operate on an item, but the property which holds the text we want to use for filtering has a different name all the time, then we could also just accept a second argument which stores that specific property name of the values we're trying to search in a given component. So then, for example, here we could add a search prop, or whatever you want to name it, parameter, and simply access user search prop. So dynamically access a property based on the value we get on this parameter. And maybe rename this from user to item. So both works, but with that we have a more flexible filtering logic here. Now, we also have a watcher here where we watch the entered search term, and whenever that search term changes, we trigger this function and set this timer. Now, here we can leave everything the way it is because both entered search term and active search term are refs defined in this function and therefore will be available. And update search should also work. So with that, the only thing we gotta do is we have to return a bunch of things so that we can use them in the component setup method where we're going to call use search. And as I mentioned, it's your function, so it's up to you how you return these things, if you bundle them together in an array or in an object. And here I'll go for an object. Before we saw an array, both is possible. Here I'll go for an object. And now let's think about what we want to expose to the component that calls use search. For that, let's maybe go back to user list, because that will be a component which will soon use this custom hook. And there, let's see what we're exposing to the template here. We're exposing the entered search and the update search function. We also rely on the available users here in our displayed users. So therefore, in our custom hook, we should absolutely expose the entered search term, the available items, and the update search function. So I'll expose the entered search term, the available items, and the update search function. That's what I'll return here in my use search function. And now we can go to userList.view, and for the moment, comment all of that out, and instead import use search from, going up 2 levels, hooks search.js. I'm not removing this view import up here because I'm still using a ref, a computed property, and no watcher, but a ref and a computed property down there. So we have to keep that around, but we can remove, and we should remove, the watch import because I'm not using watch in this file anymore. Just ref and computed. Those are still used in my setup method, even with this code commented out. But now here, we can call use search, so our own function here, and this function now needs 2 parameters. The items and our search prop. Now, the items, that was props.user, if you remember. That is what we used here before. So props user is what I want to feed into use search. And for the property, which we wanted to use for filtering on every user, that was the full name property, which we should pass in as a string. As a string because property names in JavaScript objects are strings. So we pass this in as a string. And then we get back some values here. In this case, we get back an object because I return an object in my custom use search function. And in there, we'll have these 3 properties. So we can again use object destructuring here with this syntax to get the entered search term, the available items, and the update search function. Entered search term will be a ref. Available items is a computed property and therefore a read-only ref. And update search is a function. Now we can use these things here. For example, in displayed users, I'm relying on available users. This is now available items. And of course, we could rename this here in this setup method if you wanted to stick to available users, but I will just go with available items. The rest should be fine. And then here I return the entered search term and update search to the template so that it's available there. If we now save this reloads, but I see no users. That is just a typo I have here, though. I should pass in props.users, since users is my prop name here. So if I use that, then I am feeding in users, and now we see them here. Now sorting works, and what about searching? That is looking good, as you can tell. Here we are able to search and sort and select users just as we did it before, but now we're doing this with our own custom hook that supports us with that. And we got this use search hook now and can therefore get rid of all that commented out code. And now this line here, or these 3 lines, replace all the code we had in there before. And of course we can now use the same in projects list because that was our main idea. We wanted to have reusable code.